Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are on the what is called the second paragraph of the Shema that is found here in Parshat Ekev. And so we're going to take a look at this here together. So, v'haya, and it shall be, v'haya im shamua tishma'u el mitzvotai. If you indeed listen, if you indeed pay attention to my commandments, asher anochi metzaveh etchem hayom, which I command you today, la'ahava et Hashem Elokechem, to love the Lord your God, u'la'ovdo, and to serve him, b'chol levavchem, with all your hearts, u'v'chol nafshechem, and with all your souls. So, what can I say about this? Let's take a look at the Rashi. V'haya im shamua, and it shall be, if you hearken, if you listen, if you pay attention. And of course, that is an understanding of human nature, is to not really pay attention, not really be drawn to do this and to listen to it and to pay attention to it. So, v'haya. So, v'haya has the meaning of as a consequence, right? As a consequence. Musav al ha'amur lamala. It is dependent on what is said above. In other words, this v'haya means as a consequence, and it's dependent. Rashi's telling us that it's a consequence of something that's mentioned above. And what is mentioned, well, read what he says, right? Lematar hashamayim tishte mayim. You shall just drink water from the water of heaven, from the rain of heaven. And we'll take a look right above. It's like two verses above. Here it is, right? So let's take a look here. And so what's happening is God is describing the land of Israel. He says, "Haaretz asher atem ovrim shama l'rishta," the land which you are passing over there to inherit it. Eretz harim uvakaot. It's a land of mountains and valleys. And there it goes, the matar shamayim tishtem. According to the rain of heaven, you shall drink water. And the issue here is that there's a comparison to Egypt, which is watered by the Nile, and which involves having to create irrigation, human efforts in order to sufficiently irrigate the crops. And the point here is that it will be provided, since it comes down from the sky, that you're not going to have to create irrigation in order to water your crops. So now it's dependent on God, and that's the point that's going to be made here, is that this water that's going to irrigate the crops will actually come. You will be able to rely on God for that. So let's take a look, keep going. V'haya im shamua tishma'u. So that's the consequence, right? If, in fact, you'll be able to get, which is going to be stated explicitly, you're going to be able to get adequate rainfall for all your crops. You're going to be able to eat in abundance and to satiety, etc., etc. But if you perform these mitzvot, v'haya im shamua tishma'u. So, and I translated this as if you indeed pay attention. So in Tractate Sukkah, in the Talmud, page 46, it says, Im tishma b'yashan. So they're parsing this out to mean, if you listen to what is old, tishma b'chadash, you will pay attention to what is new. In other words, what it's saying is essentially that in principle, you have to accept it. You have to look at this material and not make distinctions as to what's old and what's out of date and what's new, etc., and sort of say to yourself, well, I will certainly perform the new things. I'm not going to really, the older stuff is out of date and not really there. And I think that's what Rashi's trying to point out, that when you start to do that, when you start to look at the material in that particular way, then you really, what you're really saying is, I don't want to do it at all. Don't want to do it at all. And that's just human nature. So here we go. Some other examples. V'chein, and likewise, Devarim Chet in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. V'haya im shachoach tishkach, right? If you forget, you will forget, right? So the way we'd probably translate it is if you indeed forget. So here we go. Im hidchalti lishkoach, if in fact you begin to forget, sofcha shetishkach kula. So the beginning of the process basically predicts the end of the process. It's a process. Shekain kutiv b'Megillah, and this I looked to see what it was referring to. So it says, "Thus it is written, so it is written." And I think Megillah, of course, is also the name of a tractate, but there's no reference to a page number. So if it's simply referring to a scroll, I'm not sure what scroll it's referring to. If it's referring to the tractate Megillah, because it's not it is. I don't think that it's not in the Megillat Esther. It's not in the what we call the Megillah. So it could be referring to one of the five Megillot. It's quite possible. I wasn't able to. I didn't bother to check to see what the reference is. But what it does say is, Im ta'azveni yom. Should you leave me a day for a day, yomayim azaveka. And for 2 days I will leave you. So, in other words, obviously saying, if you already start turning in this direction, then it's going to have greater implications than what may appear on the surface. Mitzvah mitzaveh etchem hayom. So he's parsing out every little part of this verse, right? Command you today. So what's the force, right? What's the force of today? Shehiyu aleichem chadashim, that you should look at these as just having been given, like today's news. You know, we have, of course, the expression yesterday's news as saying it's no longer of any great importance to us. It's yesterday's news. So it's saying to look at it as something that's fresh and new, etc. Ki ilu shematem bo yayom, as if you just heard this that very day, right? Today. And that's in the Sifrei. La'ava et Hashem, to love the Lord. Here we go. Shelot tomar, that you shouldn't think, you shouldn't say, Hare ani lomed, indeed I am going to learn, bishvil, so that she'eyeh ashir, so that I can become rich, bishvil ekra she'ekra rav, so that I can be called a rabbi or master, bishvil she'ekabel schar, so that I will receive a reward. So when you do it out of love, it's because you have such a deep desire to do it, and there isn't some external reason that you have for doing this. Ella, but kol ma asu, everything that you perform, asu me'ava, you should perform it out of love. V'sof hakavod lavo, and in the end, the honor will come of itself. But looking in now, of course, at our motivations to do this. So it's one thing, of course, to pay attention, to even consider it important, and then beyond that, not to do it for the sake of getting a reward so that you're rewarded. However, we also know that there's a statement that says, Shelo lishma ba lishma, that if at least you're doing it, even if you're doing it for the sake of a reward, because you think you're going to get some kind of reward for doing these things, eventually you may well do it without expecting a reward at all, because it's so important to be engaged in this particular practice. To serve him with all your heart, with all your hearts. Avodah. So what are we talking about here? Avodah shehi balev. In other words, we're talking about to serve him with your heart. What are we talking about when we talk about service that is in the heart? Vezohi tefillah. This is prayer. So when we go and we participate in worship and in prayer, right? In looking at those words and in trying to have those words come from our hearts as we're addressing God and addressing our Maker. That's a very important activity. For one, I think it gives us the right frame of mind. It gives us the right thoughts to have that can allow us during the rest of the day when we're not actively engaged in prayer, a way in which to conduct our lives in this particular medium. So here we are being given a commandment to pray. Going on, Shehat Filah, because prayer karui, it's called avodah, it is also called service. In other words, even though you're not physically exhausting yourself with some physical kind of labor, nevertheless, prayer itself is considered service. Shinemar, and Rashi supports what he's saying. Shinemar, as it says in Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 6, Aramaic here, Elahach di ant palach, the God which I serve. Palach is another word for avodah. It's the Aramaic for avodah. Palachle, which to whom I serve. Betadira, constantly. In other words, I'm always serving him. V'chiyesh pulchan. So since he's using the word palach, and the word pulchan is also a reference to sacrificial worship, he says, V'chiyesh pulchan bevavel. He says, is there in fact an altar in Babylonia? Is there in fact the ability to serve God in the temple in Babylonia? Ella, but al shahaya mitpalel she'alam. Okay, but it was because he engaged in prayer. Daniel engaged in prayer. How do we know this? Shineamar, because it says also in chapter 6, I think this is kavin patichan, and open windows lay. He had open windows up in his second story of his house that were facing Jerusalem. And there's a story there that people saw him in an act of worship and accused him to the king that he was not being loyal. But the point was that he was engaging in prayer. V'chein b'David, and likewise regarding David, King David, who Omer, King David says, and this is the book of Psalms, Psalm 141, Tikun filati, establish my prayer, ketoret lechvanecha, as incense before you. So again, even though worship, prayer, services appears to be more of an intellectual activity, nevertheless, it's tremendously important. And even though we don't have a temple and we can't actually be offering up sacrifices, there is a tremendous value to the fact that we engage in worship and the service, as it's called, service of the heart. With all your hearts and with all your souls. V'halo kvar, he's here. But weren't we already warned? Weren't we already told? B'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, right? That what we refer to as the first paragraph of the Shema, which is in Deuteronomy 6, where it says, with all your heart and with all your soul. But notice it says, b'chol levavchem v'chol nafshechem, which is the plural, right, pronoun. Whereas here it's in the singular. Ella, however, azhara leyachid. So it is azhara is like a warning, a commandment in this case to an individual. So b'chol levavcha, azhara letzibur. It's also a commandment to the congregation. So whereas worship by yourself, in other words, caring enough to try to engage in daily worship as an individual, it's important, but nevertheless, being part of a community and worshiping as part of a community is also very, very significant. Going to the next verse. So here we are. Remember above it talked about matar haaretz or matar hashamayim. So it says, I will give the rain for your land, be'ito, in its proper time, in its due time. Yoreh, Rashi's going to explain what the yoreh is. Malkosh, and again, this term malkosh, the Rashi's going to explain these. Va'asafta deganecha, and you will be able to gather your corn, v'tiroshcha, your wine, v'yitzharecha, and your oil. So again, what it's linking is that we are serving God, not only we're observing mitzvot, but we're also serving God in worship, and there are going to be these blessings that Deuteronomy is promising us. Let's take a look here. And I will give the rain of your land. And in the Sifrei it says, Asitim masha aleichem, since you have done your obligation, since you've practiced your obligation, afani e'eseh masha alai, I will also, this is God speaking, of course, I will perform my obligation. Be'ito, at its proper time. What's the significance of saying at its proper time? Balailot. In other words, when's the rain going to fall? It's going to fall at night, shelo yatrichu etchem, so that it doesn't put you to trouble. Davar acher, another interpretation in the Sifrei again, be'itor, referring to at its time, belele Shabbatot, on Friday nights, shakol mitzuyim bevatehem, because on Friday night everyone's home at their meal and enjoying Shabbos. So of course, when it rains on a Friday night, it's a very good sign that it's doing that. Yoreh. So here we go. Here's this term, yoreh. He revi'ah hanofelet. Okay, we're talking about the autumn rain. The yoreh is the rain that falls in the autumn. La'achar, it falls la'achar hazri'ah, after the seeds are planted. So, of course, Mediterranean climate has rainfall in the wintertime, and so the seeds for the fields would be planted in the fall, and then we would hope that the rain would come. And shemarveh, and here's the revi'ah, right? It saturates the land, et haaretz, ve'at hazra'im, and the seeds. Umalkosh, and this term malkosh, revi'ah hayoredet samuch lakatzir. That is the rain that occurs near the harvest, the reaping. Lemalot hatfu'ah, so as to fill the produce, bekasheha, on its stalks, so that you have these full and rounded and healthy stalks of wheat, etc., corn, velashon malkosh, and he says the expression malkosh, davar hamauchar, the word it refers to a latter, something that is later. Kedemetargaminan, just as we see in the Targum in Genesis chapter 30. Vahaya ha'atufim lelavan. So this is the story of where Jacob is being paid by Laban for all his labor. He worked for him for 20 years, and Laban is finally paying him, and Laban is trying to trick him out of getting a decent salary, so to speak, which is being paid in flocks. And Jacob is able to devise a way to avoid Laban's trying to trick him. And so that it turns out that the way when the flocks procreate, the runts of the flock go to Laban. Okay, and that's translated lekashia. In other words, ha'atufim is lekashia. Davar acher, another interpretation. Lechach nikret malkosh. It's also referred to as malkosh. Sheyoredet al hamelilot, because it falls on the ripe ears. The al hakashin. There's the malkosh, right? And the mal would be melilot, and the kosh would be kashim. So in other words, that it falls on the ripe ears, and that's why it's called malkush, that it's a combination of these two words. Va'asafta deganecha, you shall gather your corn. Ata tasfena. So again, you will gather your corn. Ata tasfena. So it's placing an emphasis here on the fact that you're going to be able to gather it after having planted it and tended to it and taken care of it. You will reap the reward, right? You will gather it. El habayit, to your homes, velo oivecha, and not your enemies. Your enemies won't be able to come and take advantage of all the work you've done. Ke'inyan, as we see, Shenemar, as it states in Isaiah 62, Im eten etekadcha, right? If I will, that this is a prophecy of consolation, that God is assuring the Jewish people that he will not turn their corn, their crops to the enemies. Kim asfav yochluhu. But the ones who gather it, that's you, yochluhu, they will eat it, they'll consume it. Velok inyan shenemar, and it's not going to be like this other situation in the book of Judges, chapter 6, V'haya im zara Yisrael. So here, he doesn't finish off the sentence, but basically he's saying that in this case, the Israelites would do all the work regarding the farming, etc., and the enemies would come and reap the harvest. And we will stop here today. So I'm going to put the marking in. And for tomorrow, God willing. And I'm going to stop the share. David, thank you for joining me. Before I stop the recording, do you have any thoughts about what's happening here?
No, we'll stop the recording.
Okay. All right. Very good. So let me just say this. Look, clearly this is something that a lot of people have difficulty with, the idea that our behavior can influence the weather. Except I would say that nowadays we have ample evidence that our behavior as human beings can influence the weather, if not in quite the way that it's being described here. But you can see that within this Torah way of looking at things, and in believing in God, and in believing in this power, this transcendent power, we put a great deal of stock in terms of the behavior that we have and what comes as a result into our lives. So that I think that is actually part of having real faith in the divine. And I'll stop with that.